ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming and being with us, especially that we had a half-a-day conference yesterday as well, so it's a pretty crowded event calendar at the New Institute now. And, of course, Easter is pretty close as well.
Closer for some than for others.
That's true.
I'm Orthodox.
But, we're a Catholic majority country, so... But still, true. But it's my pleasure to have Rod Dreher, who is our joint visiting fellow with MCC here with us tonight. And our idea was to have this light, a bit informal discussion with Rod about his career, his experiences here in Hungary. And also we will hopefully have some time for you to ask some questions from him as well.
And Istvan very kindly promised not to ask about the prison years. So thanks for that.
I will try my best, but I think I also told you that the audience might just get into those.
I'm an open book.
Embarrassing details. So, okay. Well, my first question would be basically looking at your childhood, and you were born in a small town, and you raised in a small town.
I was assigned male at birth.
Yes, but I think you still do that in America now. So, or you have states where they don't sign gender anymore.
No, you don't. We don't. You're right, but unfortunately, Louisiana, where I was born, was not one of those states.
Well,
we keep it real.
Yes, and in a state which some people would say it's in the deep south. So, what would you say? How did this, influence your life? I think you left quite early the city and lived in bigger cities, but you moved back eventually, and still living in a much smaller town. But how did these experiences living, growing up in this small city or town, more likely, shape your future? How do you think?
Well, it was in South Louisiana that I first learned to hate Alabama. I'm sorry, I'm trolling my dear friend Melissa, who is from University of Alabama. In Louisiana, football is the true religion. LSU, Louisiana State University football, and Alabama is our arch rival. But anyway, I did grow up in a small town of 2,000 people on the Mississippi River, and it was a pretty great place to grow up. But though I didn't realize it until I got out, I grew up in a family that hunted, fished all the time. We were outdoors people, but I was an avid indoorsman as a young boy, and I always had my head in a book. And I remember I had these two old aunts, Aunt Lois and Aunt Hilda, who were born in the 1890s in our little part of Louisiana, but they were so adventurous. When they were young women, they went off to France as nurses for the Red Cross during the Great War. And they were served in the canteen in Dijon. And I got to know them at the very end of their life. They lived in a little cabin that was built before the Civil War at the end of a pecan orchard. And my mom, when I was a toddler, she would give me diapers and tell me to go walk to their cabin, and I would spend the day with them. Those sweet old ladies, we would sit on their red leather sofa, and gosh, they were old. They had bones like bird legs, But they would lay out the photo album that they had from their time in France and show me all the places they had been. Hilda told me the story about how on the day the armistice was signed, she was on the Champs-Élysées in Paris, and a Frenchman grabbed her and kissed her, and she couldn't get over it. And all of this stuff was so magical to me. And they would tell me things about the world, about Europe. And I remember we would watch the news, or we would read Time magazine together. I remember I'm like 4 or 5 years old. And I remember those magical words, Moscow and Kissinger. They seemed so unusual to me, but this is what was going on at the time. Aunt Hilda looked at my palm one day. She was an Episcopalian, but kind of a loony one. She looked at my palm to read my palm, and she pointed to a line on my palm and said, "This means you're going to travel a lot one day." And I remember thinking as a kid, boy, I hope that's true. And it turned out to be exactly right. And I can thank those dear old ladies for giving me a love of travel and a love of Europe. And lest anybody think that women were badly oppressed back in the day, Aunt Hilda stayed in the Red Cross when she came back to America. And during the 1927 flood, which was probably the worst natural disaster to hit the United States until probably Hurricane Katrina, Aunt Hilda wanted to take command of a boat full of supplies to take to the people who were stranded on an island, and what had become an island. And the Red Cross officials said, "Oh, no, that's too dangerous for a woman." She disguised herself as a man, took command of the boat, and went off. So, with women like that in the background, people like that as relatives, I was destined to do fun things overseas. But my dad always thought that Hilda and Lois were ruining me by making me dream about going somewhere else. My father loved them, but he was a man of the country, the man of the soil, the first in his family to get a college education, but he distrusted city intellectuals. And he could see that I was becoming one under the tutelage of the old women. And eventually, I did leave at age 16 to go to a boarding school in North Louisiana, and that was when I left home. I remember getting on the ferry. There was a car ferry across the Mississippi River from our town to the other side. We got on the car ferry when my parents were taking me to school, and I remember looking back at the bank of the Mississippi where my town was and thinking, goodbye, I'll never see you again. Well, I did come back many years later, but maybe we'll get to that.
So it wasn't the typical small town upbringing because of your aunts who basically instilled in you this curiosity towards Europe and other countries perhaps. And that's pretty interesting, especially the deep south, because again I will embarrass Melissa, because when I was staying in Alabama I met a lot of taxi drivers who actually were asking me where I've been in America, and when I told them they were really amazed because they said they'd never been to DC, for example. Some of them never even left the States. So I guess that's still pretty unusual even in today's America. Because some people just stay in the near vicinity or in the near, sometimes even in the same state.
They do, but that has changed so much with my generation. I remember I was born in 1967, and in the late 70s, early 80s, it was either at the end of the Carter years or the beginning of the Reagan years, they deregulated the airline industry. And suddenly, people of our social class, we were like lower middle class, we could afford to travel. It became really cheap to go to Europe. I can remember as a small child, there was a wealthy farmer and his wife who lived across the country road from us. And the farmer took his wife to Europe, to Paris for their wedding anniversary. Must have been 1974. And I thought that was the most amazing thing I'd ever heard. It was as if they had gone to the moon and back for me, to think that I knew somebody besides my old aunts who had been to Paris. But then, in 1984, just 10 years later, it seems like a lifetime later, just 10 years later, my mother won a trip to Europe in a church raffle. She bought a ticket, and she didn't want to go. She didn't want to travel, but she knew that I really wanted to. I was 17 years old in high school, and I dreamed of going to France to see the museums, to walk in the footsteps of Ernest Hemingway and all that. And suddenly my mom called and said, guess what, you're going. The catch was I was to be the only young person on a bus full of elderly American tourists. But I didn't care. I was going to France. So the bus was making its way across France. We'd come across England, from England, on the hovercraft. That actually existed then, on the hovercraft. And we were heading towards Paris. We stopped an hour outside the city to go see an old church. And I thought, another old church? Oh my gosh. But I went in anyway, and it was there that my life changed, because it was the cathedral at Chartres, and one of the most glorious churches in all the West. But I didn't even know what it was. I mean, there was nothing in my life and background growing up in late 20th century America in a small town that prepared me for the glory of God made manifest in that medieval cathedral. And I remember standing right in the middle of the labyrinth there, looking up at the rose window and all around. And I had lost my faith by then. I was typical, smarty pants teenager. But then I realized God exists. And not only does he exist, he wants me. And when I walked out of the church, I wasn't a reconverted Christian, but I was on a search that ultimately ended with my conversion to Catholicism when I was, 26.
Would you say visiting this church influenced that conversion to Catholicism? So you become interested in Catholicism because of this experience in the church?
Oh, absolutely, yeah, because I remember thinking, I want to know the kind of Christianity that could inspire men whose names we don't even know to build such a temple to the glory of its God. And coming from the town I did, we had Catholics, we had all different kinds of Protestants, but there was no sense of history, or rather, history began with the Civil War in our town. And I had no framework for something so deep as the faith as made manifest in the Shard Cathedral. And I was deeply curious. I wanted to know more. And, you just don't have places like that. Our country is a young country, America. But here was a church that was built 500 or 600 years before my country was even founded. And I was just so curious to know more about what does all this mean? What does this symbolism mean? And it drew me in. And finally, that was the first thing that happened. The Shard Cathedral, this was 84. About 9 years later, 8 or 9 years later, I had convinced myself intellectually that Catholicism was true, but I was afraid to make the leap, take that leap of faith. And then, in my first job, I was working for the newspaper in Baton Rouge, the capital of Louisiana. They sent me to interview an elderly Catholic priest, Monsignor Carlos Sanchez. They didn't send me to interview him about his religion. Before he became a priest in his 50s, Monsignor Sanchez had been an artist and the founder of the Fine Arts program at Dartmouth College in the U.S., and he was the man who was responsible for bringing the great Mexican muralist Diego Rivera to America. And that's what they were interested in. Here he was, maybe 95 years old, living in a rest home, and they wanted me to go talk to him about art. So I went to see him. I go into his little apartment, and I meet this man who's like Yoda. He's maybe this tall. He was beaming with light. He was so gentle. I couldn't believe he was 95. He would seem so young and unmarked. We sat down, and I began to ask him about his life. He told me that he had been born to a planter in Guatemala. His father was a coffee planter, and his mother was English. They sent him to the U.S. to get his education, and it was there that he lost his Catholic faith. But he didn't want to tell his parents. He didn't want to upset them. He stayed on in America, got a graduate degree at Yale, and then went to work planning the Empire State Building in New York City. One day he got a message saying that his father was dying, but his father had been alienated from the church for a while, but wanted to have a public mass of reconciliation before he passed. They wanted his son, Carlos, to come down there. So Sanchez flew back to Guatemala City, he went to the church, and he knelt to take communion. Even though he didn't believe any of it, he didn't want to upset his parents, so he just went through with the ritual. He told me that when the priest held the host out to his tongue, a burst of light came out of it and enveloped him. And he said he heard with his ears a voice say, "I have always loved you." And he was immediately reconverted. He went back to America. By then he was teaching at Dartmouth. And he felt so much shame for having ever disbelieved in God that he would wake up at 4 a.m. in the dead of a New Hampshire winter and take cold showers. I mean, that was intense. So some time went by, and he began to feel, about a decade, he began to feel a calling to the priesthood. But it made no sense back then. This was the 1940s. They didn't need Catholic priests like they do today. And it was just unthinkable that a man as old as he could become a priest. So he kept putting it off and putting it off. Finally, he was called back to the cathedral in Guatemala for the first communion of his favorite niece. He said he went in, he knelt down. This time he believed it was really Christ in the host. The same thing happened. The burst of light came out, surrounded him, and this time the voice said, "Why don't you do as I ask?" Well, he knew he had to become a priest then. He got back to America and began searching for seminaries, but it just was impossible. No one would take a man as old as he was. He was in his 40s. He finally found one in San Antonio, Texas, that took him, and at the age of 51, he was ordained a priest. He went back to Guatemala because he wanted to do work among the Indians on his father's plantation, but because there was a communist revolution, a rebellion underway, and because he was both a priest and from a wealthy family, they put his name on a hit list. His bishop sent him out of the country to Baton Rouge to save his life, and that's where he spent the rest of his priesthood, peacefully and uneventfully serving people. Now, this old man told me this story, and as he's telling it, tears are running down his face, as if these events had happened just the previous week. I knew as I was sitting there, maybe 24, 25 years old, I knew this man was telling me the truth. This man was a witness. I knew that God was real, and I knew I couldn't hide from him anymore. So after that meeting, I resolved to become a Catholic, and I was received into the Catholic Church on Easter Vigil 1993 in Washington, D.C., where I had moved right after I met Father Sanchez.
So I think a lot of people don't know that you started your career as a film critic. So I would be interested to know if you could recommend some films to conservatives, because usually we think that most of the film industry is very liberal. And I will be especially grateful if you could recommend films from let's say the past 30 years. Perhaps that makes things more difficult.
Well, I don't watch films for the sake of their politics necessarily, but for me, one of the most important films I ever saw was The Mission. It came out in the early 1980s. It's based on a true story of two Jesuit priests in Latin America during the Spanish and Portuguese colonial times. And it's a film about redemption. One of the figures in the film was a violent man who, instead of being sentenced to prison or to death, is given a chance to serve in a mission in remote Brazil, what would become Brazil. But Robert De Niro plays this man, and he ends up becoming a priest himself. But the question in the film, asked by the film, is, what is the proper response to injustice? Is violence acceptable, or should we meet violent injustice with peace, and even to the point of sacrificing one's life? It's not a question that I've ever been able to satisfactorily resolve for myself, as posed in the movie. Most times I've watched this film, I side with Robert De Niro, who wants to fight back against those who are trying to kill the Indians. But the last time I saw it, for the first time, I thought, you know what? Jeremy Irons, who plays the more pacifist Jesuit, he might have a point too. I think that what makes a good film is not necessarily its politics right or left, but whether or not it speaks to the human condition. And it doesn't offer pat answers. Another great film I saw in the last couple of years is called A Hidden Life by Terrence Malick. It's based on the true story of Franz Jägerstätter. Franz Jägerstätter was an Austrian Catholic farmer who lived in a little village high up in the Alps in Austria. When the Nazis came to town, everybody in the village became a Nazi, except him and his wife. And the thing that let him resist the Nazis and led him to resist the Nazis was his Catholic faith. The thing is, though, everybody in town went to church. Why was Franz the only one to stand up? And eventually he was put in prison and murdered by the Nazis for refusing to take an oath to Hitler. The film is so beautiful that it poses that question: why do some people find the courage to resist? It's just so intense. And when we face a time now when people are going to have to suffer for the truth, they need to be able to draw on the stories of men like Franz Jägerstätter. Another film, though, that is one of my absolute favorites is The Lives of Others, a German film about the Stasi and spying on these artists in East Berlin. And the Stasi agent who, if you haven't seen it, I'm not going to ruin it for you, but the Stasi agent who is in charge of spying on them comes to see them in a very human way. And this film is a tremendous indictment of the inhumanity of communism, but what can turn a man from that evil is learning to see the humanity of those he thinks of as his enemies.
And would you say you have some conservatives in Hollywood? So could you name at least some actors or directors who you consider perhaps not even conservatives, but some people who might be more religious and more to the conservative side? Because we have these discussions and sometimes you hear that, yes, Mel Gibson or perhaps Clint Eastwood is a conservative. But I'm not sure, so I'm interested in a film critic's opinion.
Yeah, I don't think there are too many, and if they're there, they know to keep it quiet so they can keep working. But Patricia Heaton is someone who's become a friend of mine. She was best known for a TV show called Everyone Loves Raymond, and she is a Catholic and strongly pro-life, openly pro-life, in a city where that can hurt you. But she has used her fame to talk about her faith and to talk about the sanctity of unborn life. Her sister, by the way, is one of the Nashville Dominicans. They're a religious order. They're Dominican nuns, but they live in Nashville, Tennessee, and they're known for being very conservative.
I think you made your name, but you might disprove me, with an essay which you wrote to National Review about people you called the crunchy cons and about granola conservatism, which eventually became a book in 2006. Actually, I only read this book after I read the Benedict Option, but still I was surprised in some of the elements which are already there. About these conservatives who share some, values, perhaps with liberals. And I actually had to Google Birkenstock sandals because I had no idea what those are. And I think a couple of years ago I didn't know what granola was, but now my wife makes it as well, so it's actually pretty good. And it is crunchy, so I will give you that. But how do you see that? I mean, because I had this idea that if there's some values which are similar, or at least some practices, I mean, this idea that the environment is important, that local community could be important. In America, homeschooling. Does this mean that perhaps we have some platform where we could work together with some progressives or liberals, or not?
Well, yeah, the book called Crunchy Cons, cons being short for conservatives, came out of an essay, as Istvan says, that I published in National Review after a really interesting subway ride home from National Review's offices in Manhattan to where I lived in Brooklyn with my wife and our baby, Matthew. And I said to it was a summertime, and I said to my boss at National Review, hey, can I leave early today? I have to pick up the delivery of vegetables from our CSA, which is short for Community Supported Agriculture. We had subscribed to this service where a small family farm out on Long Island would once a week bring a box of vegetables, an assortment of vegetables, whatever the fresh thing they're growing on the farm that week is. Mind you, this is back in 2002, so this sort of thing is now widespread in America, but it was not at the time. My boss said, organic vegetables, that's kind of liberal, isn't it? I thought, well, I guess, yeah, sure. But on the subway ride home, I was thinking about this, and I looked down at my feet, and I was wearing Birkenstock sandals. Now, Birkenstocks are a symbol of liberalism in America. They're hippie shoes. And I thought about how I never would have worn Birkenstocks in my life, but right after I got married, my wife and I moved to Manhattan, and suddenly my back was killing me from walking around Manhattan in dress shoes or other shoes. She said, get some Birkenstocks, it'll help your back. I said, those are liberal shoes. I don't want those hippie shoes. She said, oh, come on, don't be silly. You'll find they're really practical. And she graduated from college in Austin, Texas, so they know from Birkenstocks in Austin. So I tried the shoes on, and lo, they worked. My back didn't hurt anymore. And in fact, we started getting the organic vegetables because, not so much because they were organic, but because we wanted to support small farmers. Because as conservatives, I began to think about the ways that my wife and I were not really on the Republican Party reservation, even though we voted Republican, we were Republicans, but not because we were secretly liberal, but because of the kinds of conservatives we were. For example, we loved old houses and old things, traditional neighborhoods, all of these things that are typically not appreciated by your average Republican, although I think that has changed somewhat. I wrote an essay about tradition and loving to conserve the environment, not because you're an environmentalist like someone on the left, but because conservation and learning to love the natural world is part of being conservative, or a proper conservatism. And I realized I was much more in line with the conservatism of Russell Kirk, who was a traditionalist back in the 50s and 60s. I was more in line with him than with the libertarians. I wrote an essay about it for National Review Online, and it was kind of lighthearted and funny. Granola conservatives, we called it, because my wife made her own granola. I got 500 emails from conservatives all around the country saying, "Me too, that's me." You know, and I thought, I'm not a liberal, I'm pro-life, or I'm this or I'm that, but I don't really fit in with the Republicans either. Thank you for articulating this stance. And I forgot to say, though, that our conservatism came more from our Catholic faith, learning to value the things our Catholic faith said to us. And when Republican Party ideology conflicted with our Catholicism, then we chose Catholicism. It didn't make us liberal, but it made us just a different kind of conservative. I found, though, that whenever I would come visit friends in Europe after CrunchyCons was published in 2006, they would tell me in continental Europe, like, this is really not news for us. This is what it means to be a conservative in much of Europe.
But you didn't actually answer the question.
What was the question?
Which I posed, I'm sorry to say, but can this be a bridge between some liberals and conservatives? Because reading this, in the book you write down this subway ride. I was thinking about this, that perhaps this could be something which can act as a bridge with at least some liberals. We perhaps still share some values at least.
You know, when I was reporting the book, we were living in Dallas, Texas by the time I got around to writing the book. And I interviewed a farmer who was a fundamentalist Christian. He and his family had a lot of kids, and they did organic agriculture. Again, not because they were liberals, but because of the particular nature of their Christian convictions about the earth and how to treat the earth. And the man told me, he goes, you know, we're really conservative, but we find often that we have more in common with the hippie organic farmers down the road in the country where we live than we do with suburban Dallas Republicans. And so for him, living out in the country, it was a practical thing. When you're out in the country, and this is how I grew up too, you can't really afford to be ideological because you never know who you're going to have to call to help you saw up a tree that has fallen over your driveway, or if your heat has gone out in the middle of the winter, that sort of thing. So the fundamentalist Christians had made friends with their hippie neighbors, and I noticed when they had a work day out on their farm, a lot of people in Dallas who are leftists but who are into this kind of farming came out there to help them. And they were so wonderful, the fundamentalist family. They completely blew away any sort of left-wing cliche about fundamentalist Christians. They were just good people who had a lot of integrity, kind of somewhat Amish-like. So I think that it could cause things you could build bridges in local situations. The problem is, though, this came out in 2006. American politics have become so incredibly polarized since then, and I think this is the key thing, all local politics has become nationalized. So I remember talking to my mom a couple of years ago. She still, at the time, lived in our small town. I was asking her about one of the elections coming up. I said, how do local people think about it? She said, oh, we don't ever talk politics anymore. I'm like, really? Why not? She goes, because you never know. You don't want to offend somebody. Even at this small town, people used to be able to discuss Republicans versus Democrats in a neighborly way. Now, though, people are so quick to be angry. And my mom showed me, even on Facebook, how some local woman who was just crazy left had started attacking her own neighbors for being pro-Trump. I mean, attacking in a really vicious way. And I think it's probably fair to say, I'm not on Facebook, but there must have been some conservatives in town who would have attacked them too. It's really become hard to think about building bridges across political divides in America. You would, in a previous America, you might have been able to do this at church, but now research shows that people tend to choose their churches on the basis of their politics, as opposed to their politics on the basis of what their church teaches them.
Well, yes, I'm sorry to say I agree, and I think that's happening increasingly more in Europe as well, and potentially here in Hungary as well. I'm ashamed to say that the first time I I heard about your work was actually with Benedict Option, and one of our mutual friends, Gergely Silva, he recommended to me, and actually he wrote a pretty good article in Mondiner when the book was still not published in Hungarian about it, which piqued my interest. But also you faced some criticism, not from Gergely or me, but I mean, reading your book, I understand to some extent this criticism as well, that you're basically recommending for conservatives and especially Christians to just not fight the fight and go back to their communities and just let liberals and progressives run amok. I don't think that's really true.
That's not really what I say, but I know. Have said that. Yeah,
I know, and that's why I'm just interested in how would you react to those criticisms.
Well, I wrote this book, The Benedict Option. It was published in 2017, but I had been thinking about it and writing columns and blog posts about it for over a decade. The idea comes from the famous final paragraph in the philosopher Alistair MacIntyre's 1982 book, After Virtue. In the book, MacIntyre, who was an atheist at the time, he's since converted to Catholicism, he wrote a book about how we, since the Enlightenment, we have fallen into a state of incoherence and chaos in moral discourse. The Enlightenment, he says, tried to form a coherent model for society based on reason alone, but it failed. But we haven't gone back to the Bible or anything like that we used before. So now our discourse is only a matter of emotion. He called it emotivism, or people have come to believe that what is right and wrong is based on what they feel, not reason. He says that we have gotten to the point in our society that is reminiscent of Rome and the Western Roman Empire in its final stage. MacIntyre said that in that earlier time, in the late 5th century, there were men and women of virtue who no longer associated living the moral life with sustaining the empire and the imperial structures. Instead, what they sought to do was to build small communities within which the moral life could be lived during the Dark Ages. And he said, we are now living in just such a time, even though we have a lot more money and technological sophistication. He said, what we're waiting for now is a new and doubtless very different Saint Benedict. That haunted me. Benedict of Nursia, the Saint Benedict, was a young man, Christian man, who was sent down to the city of Rome after Rome had fallen to the barbarians to finish his education. And when he got there, he saw that it was just a disaster. He feared that if he stayed there, he would lose his faith. So he went out to the woods to live in a cave in the side of a mountain in Subiaco and pray and fast and read the Bible and ask God what to do with his life. 3 years later, he came out. He had written the rule of what we now call the Rule of St. Benedict. It was a guide for how to run a monastery. And he eventually became an abbot and founded 13 monasteries in the vicinity of Rome before he died in the year 547. In the hundreds of years, the centuries after he died, his monastic rule really took off. Thousands of monasteries all across Europe, barbarian-ruled Europe, were founded. And these monks preserved the faith, but also the Western tradition by recopying these books from the Greco-Roman period that had been saved. They eventually laid the groundwork for the rebirth of civilization in Europe. And my thought is, what would a Saint Benedict who appeared today have to say to us? And that was the genesis of the Benedict option, because I believe that we are probably at a point of no return in terms of saving this civilization. This is not to say we shouldn't fight. We have to fight for it. But if the only thing we do is fight politically and neglect the building up of our families, of our communities, in the faith and in the practice of virtue, then any victories we have will be Pyrrhic. In fact, I think if you look back at what's happened to the United States in the past 30 years, we've had lots of Republican victories. People like me voted Republican because we wanted to have conservative political leadership and get more conservatives on the bench. I don't regret doing that at all, but it has not saved America from losing its soul and losing its moral mind, as we see now with gender ideology, critical race theory, and things like that. So in the book, I say that we Christians who are more traditional, whatever our particular confession, we are not called to leave the world. If you're called to do that, go be Amish or go be a monk or a nun. We're called to live in the world. But if we are going to live in the world as faithful Christians, then there are practices that we're going to have to adopt in order to be resilient in the midst of this dark age.
Staying with this topic, for example, you were kind of hinting, which I partly agree, especially with young children, this idea that we should have like land periods with social media or with our phones. But one could argue that instead of abandoning social media, we should try to use it as the left is using it. And I think, for example, here in Hungary, that's actually happening. So if you look at the elections 4 years before, social media was completely, ruled by the young progressives. And during this election, I think I'm not sure it was 50-50, but it was more balanced, definitely, because, the right wing realized this here and started using these incubator kind of things for young conservatives who are doing these short videos on Facebook. So how do you see that? Would you think that this is important? So instead of abandoning modern technology, use modern technology against the progressives, or don't use it because it's still modern technology and something which is inherently perhaps harmful, especially for children?
Well, I think that once again, if we're in the world, we have to use the tools of the world. If you're in politics, you'd be crazy not to use that technology. But the thing that concerns me is that we allow technology to use us. It's a myth that technology is neutral, and it just depends on how you use it. The fact that we're on social media, and of course I'm on it too, I need it for my work, it has nearly destroyed our ability to focus and pay attention. This isn't even a controversial claim. About 12 years ago, there was a book called The Shallows that came out by a liberal guy. I forget his name. Nick. Does anybody remember the name of the author of The Shallows? Nicholas Carr. It's a great book. You should read it, and it has aged very well. He talks about how electronic media, especially and now social media, has made it much more difficult for people in this society to maintain focus and to remember things. I've seen this myself. I don't know if you've noticed it in your work, but I have such a reduced attention span. I'm doing a lot of research for a book I'm working on now, and some of the work I have to do, some of the books I have to read for research require intense attention. They're more academic. I find it exhausting in a way that I just didn't before. And so I think that in the Benedict option, when I talk about technology, I say that we have to try to keep it at some distance. There's no way not to use it, again, unless you're going to be Amish. But even the Amish use some technology. They have a really sensible rule, though. When they're presented with a new technology, they ask themselves, and they ask it together in collaboration, is this tool going to give us more than it takes away? Is this tool going to take away something that we need to live the good life? And if the answer is yes, they refuse the tool. They refuse the technology.
Interesting. I didn't know that actually about the Amish.
Can I just add quickly, I forgot to say this about the Benedict Option before. The second Benedict of the Benedict Option is Pope Benedict XVI, whom I really love. And when the book was translated into Italian in 2018, my publisher set up a conference in the Italian Senate, in a room at the Italian Senate, and invited Pope Benedict's personal secretary, Archbishop Georg Gainswein, to give a presentation. I was so nervous about it, especially when my Italian journalist friend said, you could be sure that whatever Gainswein says, Pope Benedict has approved every syllable. Now, if the Pope hadn't liked the book, I would have been really disappointed, but I'm a big boy, I can take it. Gainswein gave this speech, and it nearly reduced me to tears. He said that this book is exactly what we need now. This is what Christians need for this time of great trial. And when he finished, he got up and said goodbye and walked out. My Italian journalist friend said, this is a bombshell. This is going to go off as a bombshell in the Vatican, because a lot of the people around Pope Francis hated the book. And seriously, and I found out that they only told me at the end, the organizers, that someone in the Vatican called around the different dioceses of Italy and told them, don't allow Rod Dreher to come speak on church property because he's anti-Francis. Francis is never even mentioned in the book. And whether or not I'm anti-Francis had nothing to do with it. But this is the fact that Pope Benedict's spokesman raved about the book really just, I could have died right there and God would have been assumed into heaven.
Turning to your latest book, the first time I saw, I think, like a short snippet about what the book is about, I had originally this idea that, yes, this is very important for American audiences, because, luckily for you, you never had any experiences living in a totalitarian state. But when I started to read the book, and I was thinking that actually this is very useful for us as well. And going back to your Benedict Option, I really like this idea where you started, I think, the second chapter of the book with the flood in your home state, which nobody was expecting. And kind of this idea that most conservatives are not, really thinking that what's going on in, let's say, in Hollywood or in the cultural sphere will affect them in the long term. And I had this feeling reading the book that we in Hungary are perhaps in that same situation, not as badly because we don't have all these influences, but of course with Netflix, with Hollywood, it's already coming in. And that perhaps we are in this grace period of not knowing what's coming, but it's coming because usually if there's something in the West that eventually comes to Hungary as well. And also I was a bit saddened in the sense that I had this idea which we talked with John about as well previously, that everybody was talking about Orwell's 1984 when they're talking about the totalitarian state. But I was always thinking that what's happening now, it's more like Brave New World. And before reading the book, I thought that I came up with that idea, but I realized that it wasn't me, and and perhaps it wasn't you, because you're citing some other writers from the 60s and the 50s as well. And for me, that's much more frightening, because with Orwell, it's the dictatorship or the authoritarian regime is much more there.
And the evil is clear.
The evil is clear, but in Brave New World, and I think for me actually what the most frightening thing was, which is happening now with all the transgender things and all the operating things is, and the genetic research, is that basically you can engineer people since birth, and they will never realize. So even with the Soma and all the the films, the drugs, which are also very important and very frightening in the Brave New World, but for me the most frightening thing is that these people are basically basically genetically engineered to be something. And of course, the hero of the novel is somebody who just basically went wrong during this genetic conditioning. And you know, I'm kind of increasingly feeling that this might happen, because if you want a completely equal society, which I think progressives are striving for, then the only thing you can basically do to make people completely equal is to genetically engineer them, because you know you always have tall people, short people, thin people, fat people, and you know in some situations there were going to be inequalities. I will never be a Formula One race driver because I'm not fitting in the car, or a
it's
jockey.
white supremacy is keeping you from being a Formula One. No, I mean, look,
and that's frightening. So I'm just interested in what you think about this. Do you think that we're really heading to this brave new world? Or because in the book I had this feeling.
Yeah, we are. Well, I mean, Live Not by Lies, I assume most people here know what it's about, but it's based on what I was told by people who immigrated to America from the communist bloc, the Soviet bloc, and now they're seeing things happen in America that remind them of what they left behind. It's not Stalinism 2.0. It's what I call soft totalitarianism. It's still totalitarian. And it is coming at us very hard and very fast, mostly manifested by gender ideology and critical race theory, what we call wokeness. That's the catch-all term. What's made it come so hard and so fast is this ideology has been taken up by the elites. It is what the intellectual Wes Yang calls the successor ideology to liberalism, to old-fashioned liberalism. And it is, as you can all see if you follow the American media or the British media, it is being pushed very, very, very hard onto the schools, onto society. When capitalism and big business took up this ideology, that it was game over for us, because they're the ones who really determine where things go in American life. Just this past weekend, I was in Romania giving some speeches, and I talked to a man who works for the Romanian branch of a American multinational. He said, "You would not believe how they push LGBT on us all the time." And he said, there are a number of conservatives in our company, and we all keep our heads down because we know we would lose our jobs if we don't. We've developed a kind of language to signal where we really stand, but we don't dare talk about it in the office. This is something straight out of communism. And unless you think I'm being too melodramatic here, I was in the car with some Romanian friends driving to one of the monasteries, and I saw on Twitter that the head of Disney, Bob Chapek, made a video in which he basically confessed his ideological sins against LGBT to the entire company, promised to do better next time, etc. I played it for the Romanians in the car, and they nearly came out of their seats. They said, "We grew up with that. We grew up with that sort of thing. Confessing that you failed the revolution and promising to do better, comrade," etc. Anyway, this is here. But it's more difficult to fight because, as you say, it's more Brave New World than 1984. When I was in Slovakia researching the book, a Slovak Catholic priest said, this is more difficult than communism because under communism, the gospel shone a clear light through the darkness. This time, though, the light hits only fog. Well, why does it hit fog? It hits fog in part because all of this stuff is sold to us in terms of compassion. We all want to be compassionate. We all want to favor the weak. This comes out of Christianity, protecting the victim, protecting the weak. But they've turned it now into this monstrous totalitarian ideology. And it's also hard because it's being pushed in part and implemented in part by technology. The social credit system, Chinese social credit system, is coming for us. I'm sure of it. If you just look at what Justin Trudeau, the Canadian Prime Minister, did just before the Ukraine war kicked it off the front pages, he went after protesters in Canada and took their bank accounts away, some of them, made it impossible for them to get into their bank accounts. because they were dissenters. This is something that we are going to see happening more and more. Finally, we have fewer means of resistance today. In the book, I interviewed this man here in Budapest, Tamás Shai, who is a little older than I am. He must be in his early 60s. He said that, and he just shook his head. He was very anti-communist, but he said, we have lost more cultural memory of what it meant to be Hungarian, what it meant to be Christian, what it meant to be men and women of the West. We've lost more of that in the past 30 years of freedom that we lost in the 40 years of communism. You know, and indeed, someone else, another Hungarian, told me that of her generation, the millennial generation, she said, I'm so afraid that most of my generation here in Hungary want nothing more than for us to become a Magyar Sweden, where only thing we live for is pleasure and shopping. And that is, all of these things make it so difficult to resist this totalitarianism. In fact, they even laugh at you when you talk about it. But one of the things that I've noticed here, this is so striking, giving speeches to ordinary people in Hungary, and this weekend I gave a couple of conferences in Romania. When I tell people how far gender ideology has gone in America, they can't believe it. I mean, you can look at them in their faces and they think that this can't really be happening. I told the Romanians about how Disney recently, in the last couple of weeks, somebody leaked video of top Disney executives talking about how for years they've been putting LGBT propaganda, slipping it into movies and children's TV programming, and now they're going to ramp that up. This is Disney. You also had the Biden administration. Joe Biden said that transgender rights are the civil rights movement of our generation. Biden, the Health and Human Services Department, put out some guidelines for transgender health care for minors, children and minors. And they even talk about in there how, well, if we get to the point where we have to take children out of the homes of parents to give them hormones and surgery, we're going to do this with the utmost care, checking with the experts. This is madness. This is insane. And I tell these Romanians this, and you could tell they were trying to wrap their minds around this. And I said, trust me, this is not science fiction. This is reality today in America. And you people have the luxury of time. It's coming for you. Brussels is going to try to push it on you. I said, look at what Brussels is doing to Hungary. It's coming for everybody. But you have the time to organize yourselves and push back hard against this. Learn from the mistakes we've made in America. I'll get off my soapbox now, but I feel so passionate about this because, you know, the robbing of the innocence of children, it's incredible. Oh, and I talked to some woman here last summer in Budapest, a woman who's a conservative, and she said, I don't understand my son. He's 19 years old, and he asked me last week, Mom, have you ever kissed a girl? She wanted to slap him. He said, hey, Mom, my generation is experimenting with our sexuality and with our gender. It's no big deal. And I said, where did he get that? She said, well, 2 years ago, he said he was never going to read Hungarian media again. He was only going to get media and social media from America and Britain. There you have it.
Well, I agree, and that's why I think the book is a wake-up call, and I think it's pretty good that it has been translated to Hungarian quite recently. Because I had the same feelings. So if you look at what's happening in a lot of the multinational companies, it's already here. I remember when you arrived, we had this controversial case, and we talked about it with this, kneeling Statue of Liberty statue in Budapest, which was put up by the progressive mayor, which had no relevance in Hungary, but still it was still erected. And you had this feeling that the progressive elites are the same here as in America, despite differences. So I think it's pretty important that you wrote this book and that it's translated now to Hungarian. But staying with the child protection things, Hungary, quite recently passed a law which I'm not sure I'm right, but my feeling is being reproduced in America as well, especially in Florida with the infamous "Don't Say Gay." I think it's called.
Don't Say Gay law, which it never says gay in the law, but that's
it's about sexual education basically for kindergarten children and primary school children. But do you think that legislations like these are helpful and could produce better results?
About the Don't Say Gay law, it was in fact modeled in part after what Hungary did last summer. I was told this by a conservative reporter who was visiting during the election week here, and he said he talked to the press secretary, I think, of Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida, and she said, "Oh yeah, we were watching the Hungarians, so yay Hungary." The media in America have gone berserk over the so-called Don't Say Gay law, which is a much, much, much softer version of what Hungary had. It only says that in public schools, you cannot bring up sexuality or gender ideology for children age 9 and below. That's it. It's unthinkable to me that teachers would have been talking about this stuff anyway, but apparently they had to make a law about this. The left has gone berserk about it, but I saw some polling done by an independent research firm showing that overwhelmingly Americans support this law, even 53% of those who voted for Joe Biden. I think the Democrats have no idea what they've done here. And the problem, though, is the Republicans, it's not going to be enough for them to say we oppose this. They need to get busy and make companies who are pushing this pay a price. There's talk now that the Republicans, if next time they come to power, need to take away Disney's copyright protection. Well, Disney's company spent a fortune lobbying Congress to extend its copyright protection past the normal 100 years. They need to lose that. This is one of the things I say that conservatives in America need to learn from the Orban government. Viktor Orban understands that we are in a civilizational war here. This is not just typical left-right. This is about civilization. When they come after your kids, it is something so serious. And Orban is willing to play hardball politics with them in ways that most Republicans have not been willing to do. I think that has to change. And the way the left and the Democratic Party and the media are reacting to something as minor as saying no sex talk in public school for children up to age 9, that tells you how they're ready to fight too. And parents and conservatives have got to get off the fence here. This is one of the problems too. You can't just depend on politics to do it. Politics is necessary, but not sufficient to fight this stuff. We have got to have churches talking about it. You've got to have families talking about it and not trying to avoid trouble. I talked to a priest in my own country about a year ago, and I said, "Father, gender ideology, it's here." This was in my own town, Baton Rouge. Gender ideology is here. It's in the schools now. What are you doing in your church to prepare families to fight this? Because it's so crazy. Most people think this couldn't be real. Meanwhile, their children are being propagandized in the schools. And schools, as you may know, many schools have formal policies stating that we will deceive parents about this. Anyway, I said this to the priest. What are you doing to prepare your people? He goes, "Oh, we're not talking about that. I don't want politics in the church." I said, "Father, this isn't politics. This is something as basic as the integrity of the family." And I could see it made him extremely nervous. He just didn't want to talk about it. That has got to go, or we're going to lose.
I strongly agree, and I think the audience as well. I will have one last question because we're running out of time, and I want to have the opportunity to give the floor to the audience as well a bit. Staying with Hungary, I mean, you spent a fair share of time in Hungary now, but do you remember when you become interested in what Hungary is doing, and how you become interested in what Hungary is doing? I think it would be interesting for me to know.
Yeah. I think it was back in 2017 or 2018. I was invited to Hungary to give a talk at a religious liberty conference. And I used that opportunity to meet my friend Anna Shai, who works with you at Danube Institute. We had corresponded before. She liked my blog and liked my writing, and I made this was a great chance for us to finally meet. And she wanted to show me around Budapest. And I remember asking her, I'm like, well, so I've heard all this stuff about Viktor Orban, and a lot of it is not very good in the American media. Help me understand why Hungarians are so fond of him and vote for Fidesz. And the things she told me gave me a new perspective on conservatism. For example, I remember the first thing she said was that Orban realized in his first term that as long as as companies, our major industries were held or were owned by foreigners, we were at their mercy. And so he worked really hard to repatriate a lot of these industries as a matter of protecting Hungarian sovereignty. And my thought as an American was, how about that? I mean, imagine a conservative politician using politics to benefit the common good as opposed to benefit what major corporations think is the common good. And then the more I began to hear about her from the inside, things that we never hear about Hungary in the American media, the more curious I became. And Danube Institute had me come in to give a talk, and just meeting ordinary Hungarians and realizing that this country is not what it's portrayed as in our media made me interested. And I went deeper and deeper. And Melissa Sullivan said to me at the National Conservatism Conference in Rome, would you like to come to Danube as a fellow? And I said, yeah, I'd like to. I'd like to learn more about Hungary and how they do things. Well, it was delayed a year by COVID, but I finally did come here, and it took I've told the story many times, but it's worth telling again. It took about 10 days for me to realize this country is so different, and it gets slandered in America, but not only do I want to defend it against the slanders, but I think there's a lot that American conservatives have to learn about how they do things here. So I texted my friend Tucker Carlson and said, you need to come over here and see this country. There's a story here. He said, I'd like to do it, but there's too much red tape with the embassy. So I put him in touch with Balázs Orbán, who cut away the red tape. Boom, Tucker came here, spent a week, and he changed the narrative on the American right about Hungary. At last fall's National Conservatism Conference in Florida, I saw so many of my friends from Fidesz that I'd met here in Hungary. And one of them said to me, or a new one who works at the embassy in Washington, she said, you can't imagine what it's like as a Hungarian to go to an international conference when people say, where are you from? You say, Hungary. And people are like, that's so cool. Tell me about it. And so I'm really glad that I
had the same feeling on that conference as well.
Did you really?
Yeah, very refreshing.
Yeah, but I'm so glad that Melissa and John and the Danube Institute made it possible for that to happen. I mean, so this is a case where the Danube Institute, and I'm not just saying this, the Danube Institute played a key role in changing the way Hungary is seen in America, and I think putting Hungary in a much stronger position the next time there is Republican Party governance.
Well, thank you for saying that.
No, but I really mean it. I do mean it.
Thank you. I think we still have a bit of time for questions from the audience. I think we have about 10 minutes, so let's try to get, let's say, 3 questions, and then Rod can answer those. I think there's a gentleman there, John, and then Ben said in the back.
Thanks so much. So I lived in China for 2 years, in Beijing. And when I was listening to your conversation, it really struck me. I wasn't expecting to hear so much about technology, but technology has definitely changed the way in which we interface with our culture. And you mentioned this very terrifying anecdote of this young Hungarian teenage boy who is essentially being enculturated through the framework of, the Atlantic, British-American sort of cultural axis of wokeness. When I was in China, I met a lot of smart people, and I didn't meet a single person who was educated on any sort of cultural media sphere other than China's. And we tend to sort of demonize the protectionist attitude that they have with regards to information. But I just wonder, maybe there are lessons to be learned there too. Maybe if Hungary, for example, had a Hungarian Twitter, I'm not suggesting a closed intranet, but something that is for the nation as opposed to for the world, it might actually allow the country to have more autonomy in preserving its own cultural interests, as opposed to being overwhelmed by the numerically superior Western interests.
That's a really interesting idea, and I haven't thought much about it, except with regard to pornography. I had dinner last fall in New Orleans with a friend who has started a software company, to help parents, filter out porn from their kids' devices. And the things this man was telling me, I mean, he's a faithful Jewish believer. We both share cultural and religious conservatism. The things he was telling me just blew my mind about how violent pornography is, how it has fully penetrated even among small kids, and how so many parents are walking around just ignorant and willfully ignorant because they don't want to say no to their kids about the devices, and so they just pretend this stuff isn't happening. I really believe that we are going to get to a point where we have to start banning this stuff for the sake of saving civilization. And I know that sounds really dramatic, but when I was listening to my friend talk about how so many psychiatrists now and psychologists are seeing 21-year-old males who are impotent, and this isn't just one or two, this is a lot of them. We're seeing young people of that generation being unable to form relationships with each other because the boys are so addicted to pornography, and the girls are terrified because when the boys do talk about the kind of sexual activity they want, it's violent and disgusting, things they've seen on porn and think of as normalized. 5 years ago, I went to an evangelical Christian college to give a speech about Benedict Option, and I was staying at the bed and breakfast run by the retired campus pastor. And we sat down and had breakfast one day. He said, I'm no longer working full-time on campus, but I still keep my hand in doing ministry. I work to help form a group of undergraduate men who want to go to seminary when they finish their undergraduate degrees. Now, mind you, this is a small, conservative evangelical college in the Midwest. He told me there are 16 young men in my group. Do you know how many of them are addicted to porn, meaning they want to stop but they can't? I said, 5 or 6? He said, 16. So yeah, I think that as a matter of defending the ability of society to exist, to be stable, and to reproduce itself, we're going to have to come to that. And that's going to be a tremendous sea change, I believe, for us, because we in the West are all about liberty and getting more and more information, no restrictions. I think that I tend to believe that in what an older version or older jurisprudence said about the First Amendment in the United States, that it protects freedom of political speech, that porn should not be protected by the First Amendment.
100%.
Anyway, sorry, I've gone on too long.
Yeah. More control can be better. I think you answered. Thank you.
Okay. Who's next?
I think it was John.
I think probably, I'm sure you've read The Camp of the Saints, which is about an earlier stage in the collapse of Western civilization. The plot has, of course, the invasion of the West by the Third World, and a group of, I think, 12 people come together in different routes as the West collapses in the Côte d'Azur. Now, if we apply that metaphor to the current situation, and you get out of the swim from somewhere else in the Mediterranean to the Côte d'Azur and to go to the Camp of the Saints, I think two of the people who would greet you and welcome you there would be Camille Paglia and Michel Houellebecq, the French novelist. Now, I want your views of them and their response to what you're describing, and any suggestions as to who else might be joining you before you yourselves are overwhelmed by the cultural apocalypse.
Oh, what a great question. Yeah, I'm a big fan of Michel Houellebecq's novels. They're very dark, but they're important to read. They're diagnostic about the fate of the West. And You know, Welbeck is in fact an indirect inspiration for this new book I'm working on now about the reenchantment of the West, because I believe with Welbeck that every society, if it's going to survive, has to have a religion. I mean, Welbeck is not a believer himself, but he's a follower of Auguste Comte, the founder of sociology, who believed that religion was necessary for any cohesive society. Well, in Welbeck's famous novel Submission, the character, the protagonist, Francois, is this dissolute, drunken academic who he's trying to find some reason to live, some reason to hold on. He goes on pilgrimage to Rocamadour, a medieval Marian pilgrimage site in France, trying to revive any sense of faith. He goes in there and begins to have a feeling, a mystical feeling, and you think that maybe he's on the verge of conversion. But then he stops himself and says, it must be something I ate. He leaves, then he goes back to Paris and eventually converts to Islam, not because he believes, but because it will make his life easier in an Islamized France. I keep that in mind, the case of Francois going to Rocamadour, because I want to speak in this new book to men and women like him who want to believe but lack the courage, the moral courage to take that step. Camille Paglia, by the way, I just read this, or I just saw something that she said in 2016. She now calls herself transgender. But in 2016, she gave a presentation, and she was in the UK, where she just laid into people who are trying to transition children. She called them monsters. She said, this is wrong, and she went on to say that Rome and Greece at the time of their collapse were societies in which androgyny was reigning in the culture, et cetera, et cetera. She's saying that we're falling apart. And it reminded me of something she said in one of her books decades ago. She though she's a lesbian, she was chastising gays for attacking the church. She said that the church is a pillar of culture. She said, we gays and lesbians can only thrive in conditions of advanced civilization. If you kick one of the pillars out from under this civilization by destroying the church, it's ultimately going to be very, very bad for us. And so, yeah, I think those two would definitely be among the defenders. And I think, frankly, that Viktor Orban would be as well. I think Eric Zemmour would be. I think that the people in the Vox party in Spain would be. This is what I think of why the populist right in Europe is the only future that Europe has. And similarly with America. I think the future will be populist and conservative, or it won't be at all.
Editorial comment. Gentlemen, I do not want to hear y'all use the left's description of the Florida bill again. If you need a moniker for it, call it the Don't Sexually Groom Our Very Young Children bill.
That's true. Well, I think we were speaking of it in ironic quotes. Yeah, but this is what the left has done, though, because they control the media narrative. You would have
control the whole language, basically.
Yeah,
that's why I don't like populism either, because I think populism is basically democracy now. I mean, they use populism is democracy, how they use it.
I think most Americans think that the Florida bill really does say you're not allowed to mention homosexuality. That's why I mentioned that the polling firm that asked Americans what they thought about it. The polling firm specifically read the language of the bill. They didn't say, what do you think of the so-called Don't Say Gay bill? They just read the language of the bill, and that's why so many Americans supported it. And this is why the media have been such lying demagogues about the whole thing. And you know, I noticed over the weekend, both the Washington Post and the New York Times called me a, quote, far-right extremist for opposing what Disney is doing, you know, and I'm thinking, this is how cut off from reality they are, opposing Disney and opposing the bill. This is how cut off from reality they are. More than half the country in America supports this bill. these people in New York and Washington writing these columns live in a bubble. And I think that, and I hope that come the elections this November, their bubble will be violently popped.
I think all of us hope that. One last question from Ben Saab.
Thank you very much, Ákos Benceget from Danube Institute. My question would be whether the American Republicans will be strong enough to resist. Because in Hungary, we see that Fidesz people resist to this temptation, to this woke culture. But what we see in Western Europe is that these parties of traditional right engage themselves with the liberals, and this is also the story of the European People's Party. So that is why, while in Hungary we are calm enough, but when we are looking on the West, we are afraid that there is no one who can resist this strong liberal tendency. So what is your opinion about that? And thank you very much for the interesting discussion.
Yeah, well, thanks for that question. I think that the Tories in the UK have been a disaster. I mean, they seem to have never found any socially liberal cause that they can't embrace. And in the US, though, I think it's very much up in the air. Back in 2015, right after the Obergefell ruling that legalized same-sex marriage, made it constitutionally mandated, I was invited to Capitol Hill in Washington to give a talk to a group of Christian staffers from both sides of the Hill, both the House and the Senate side. And then I was invited to a private lunch with them. So when the doors were closed and we had our food, I said, okay, everybody, they're all Christians, top staffers from Republican senators and members of Congress. I said, okay, Christians, we lost this one. It's a big one, meaning Obergefell. So what are you going to do? What are the Republicans going to do to protect religious liberty? Which is to say, to protect business owners, protect schools, Christian schools and others from the effects of this. Silence. I thought maybe they didn't hear me. I repeated it. Silence. Finally, one of them said very uncomfortably, well, there are currently no plans for any legislation. I walked out of there when it was over and realized that we are on our own, that these Republicans are so deathly afraid of being called bigots by the media and of getting on the wrong side of the donor class, the big business donor class, that they'll throw us under the bus. And then a year later came Donald Trump. And I was not a big fan of Donald Trump, but he changed, I'll say this for him, he changed the narrative and made it possible for a new kind of conservatism to arise, a more pugilistic conservatism, a more populist conservatism. You'll never go broke betting against the Republican Party doing the right thing. I think that if they come to power, as I'm sure they will in the Congress this fall, I mean, they won't have the White House, so there will be, they won't be able to do everything. But I hope that they give Joe Biden hell, but I hope they don't just give him hell. I want them to take on a positive agenda for pushing back critical race theory, pushing back gender ideology, and all of these things. If they don't, then they're worthless. But I think it's up in the air. I mean, we still have a lot of the same old people there, Mitch McConnell running the party, the people who don't want trouble. I think we have to be willing to make trouble. The left certainly is, and we have got to. This is one thing I learned from Orban, and I have a letter in the Wall Street Journal today talking about the things that American conservatives should learn from Orban, and that is to realize that everything is stacked against you in all the institutions in American life. They're stacked against conservatives, and you've got to be willing to fight back hard against that, make the big companies hurt if they're jamming wokeness down the throats of their employees, because otherwise we're going to get run over.
Hear, hear.
Well, thank you all so much for coming. It means a lot to me. I've loved my time here, my second time here in Hungary, and I hope you'll consider me a friend of Hungary. I certainly consider you all to be friends of mine.
One of the greatest friends, I think.
What's that?
One of the greatest friends of Hungary now. So.
Oh, well, well, and I hope to see you back next year.
Well, thank you very much, Rod, for spending this evening with us. And I would also like to thank the audience for joining us today. I wish all of you a blessed Easter. And thank you again for coming. Goodbye.